the early morning of August 18, 1991, while making a portrait, Shanghai-born artist Lin Lin was shot to death in Times Square. The following year, I attended a retrospective exhibition of Lin's work. One painting, Garnica Beijing, stayed particularly in my mind. I wanted to know more about Lin Lin, the artist and the person.
In this country, Lin Lin has the freedom to paint whatever he wants, and people have the freedom to have guns, right? So that's where the two systems meet each other, and it's pretty upsetting.
I think the great comparison that one can make between the situation in Times Square that unfortunately concluded with Ling's shooting and the situation that had occurred only a few months before in Beijing was that in the People's Republic in Tiananmen Square, one had thousands of people standing up and saying that they had the right to express themselves within the confines of their society. While in contrast, in Times Square, a short time later, one individual, Lin Lin, who had escaped from the society that had denied him those same rights, was standing up to a faceless capitalist society with unidentifiable enemies, that this one lonely individual had this horrible thing happen to him. We're all going to remember the glory of the one individual student standing up in front of the row of tanks in Tiananmen Square. I think we should also very closely remember one individual who lost his life very late at night in Times Square not too long afterwards.
It was in the fall of 1989. At that time, the Chinese government's tanks had suppressed the Tiananmen students' movement, and many people had died. A group of New York artists organized an exhibition. Lin Lin spent about 1 month in Asian American Art Center completing this work. He added to the original Guernica many figures of modern Chinese history, from Mao Zedong to Fang Lizhi, from Li Dazhao of the May 4th movement to Tiananmen student leader Cai Ling. Also added was Deng Xiaoping, then the ruler of the government, and other historical images of tanks crushing the students.
This very well-known thing, the Guernica, combined with the images from Chinese history, was sort of the culmination, it seemed to me, of his own, cultural images with paintings of Picasso that he'd studied so much. And that was just a fantastic painting. It was just incredible, and it worked on every level. I mean, there was a reason for it to be so big, and it just spoke so, it just spoke immediately to everyone who saw it about the Tiananmen Square, and it was just, it was a great painting.
I remember that 2 days before he was shot, he called me and told me that he would need to work on the street that weekend. But he also asked if I needed help, because he knew that I was moving my studio. But I knew that the weekend was the prime time for street portrait business, so I didn't want to use up his time. I said, "Don't worry about it, just go and do your portraits." It was that weekend that he was shot.
I personally feel had this man not have had a gun, maybe there would have been a fist fight. And, I'm sure that there would have been some violence, but not what happened. And I blame that completely on the freedom to have guns in this country. And I think that it is a crying shame and sheer idiocy. that is allowed to happen. So the question of freedom becomes really ironic with this story. You know.
And that was one of his, you know, the things that he didn't like about New York was here he was just trying to make a living doing portraits, and the police were giving him a hard time. And whereas, you know, the police should be protecting these people, you know. And unfortunately, police weren't there when he got shot.
And the police not only would push these guys around, they would take works of art, they would take materials, confiscate them, destroy them, damage them, and really rough these guys up, detain the people, detain the artists. So, you know, when Lin expressed any concern at all about violence in New York City, it was violence at the hands of the New York City cops. He never, ever complained about Harlem being a dangerous neighborhood. Now, you know, if we're going to believe statistics, it's a rough neighborhood, no question about it. He never mentioned that to me.
Since this is a nighttime business, we used to joke that the only difference between what we were doing and being a street prostitute was that we were selling so-called art instead of sex. But we still had to attract customers. You can't really expect any respect as a street portrait artist. There's no such thing in this business.
He didn't want to paint on the street because this has nothing to do with his art, but he had no choice. He had to go at least 2 days a week to do portrait on the street. Also, the competition among the artists on the street were very intense. This was natural. They were all trying to survive. One can't blame them.
Yet his decision to paint portraits out on the street for $5 or $10 each, rather than to offer his services through a group such as Portraits Inc., which sells portraits to the business elite for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars, which he was certainly talented enough to be doing. The suggestion had been made on numerous occasions, but he was dead set against doing it, needed to paint on the street for whatever reason it was.
This was my first year teaching in a very, very long time. And he was the toughest student I had, so in a sense I felt closest to him amongst all the students. And so I was hurt by his death.
It's going to be very hard to meet somebody else like him again, I think, for a long time, because people like him only come, I guess, once in a lifetime, or maybe a few times, but you know, you're not always there to be where they are. So I really miss him in that regard, because he was like I said, you know, in the beginning of this, was that he was the true gentleman scholar that I've always read about in Chinese literature. You know.
Before Lin Lin died, we often had discussions and debates. Sometimes we argued like children until we were ready to explode. Sometimes our debates were very serious, like scholars. As time went on, it was difficult to imagine life without Lin Lin. When he died, it was as if I had lost part of myself.
Why did I come to America? Because Lin was here. If he had been on the moon, I would have gone there too. My greatest hope in coming to America was to see Lin Lin and to live with him and for us to be happy.
He would send me Christmas cards. Now, I know people in China don't do this, but I think he saw that this was a real gesture of friendship, to send a Christmas card to an American that he had become friends with. And he said, I remember reading, it was to David, from your friend, Lin Lin. I like that very much.
During graduate school, we did an installation at the Brooklyn Art Museum for Daniel Birin, a French artist, and he had very long hair, and he hadn't taken a shower, and the hair was sticking up, way up. And this was all being documented for French TV, and he looked like a Chinese Rod Stewart or something with his hair just way up.
This is the Chinese Rod Stewart.
But no, this is later with his short hair.
Yeah, but I mean, this is the attitude thing of like, he's looking, he's questioning, he's like ready to say, tell me something I don't know already.
Right,
you know?
yeah.
It's like sort of where he was at. He was so smart. He was one of the smartest people I have ever met in my life. He really was.
When he was one day talking about my work he said, don't be afraid to be humble. And that was such just a very clear and wise thing to say about art, and life also.
Lin was a tremendously talented visual artist. Maybe the single most talented individual I've met among the thousands I've had interactions with in the art place. He could execute whatever he wanted, so he was only limited by his conception.
I think he was very serious about art and about art's role in the society or the community. I think he really believed that art could have an impact on all kinds of relationships, personal and social and political and so on. And I don't think it crossed his mind for a moment that it was not a worthwhile thing to be engaged in.
For us here in the U.S., it's just an accepted norm that anything you do that's art-related is pretty much, a wide open field. And sometimes when there is that desperation on your part to paint because of freedom, you tend to produce better works. And I think that's one of the reasons why his works had a better edge than a lot of, our works, because a sense of desperation that finally I have this freedom. I don't know how long I will have this, and therefore while I have it, I will produce some of the best things that my hands and my mind has ever come up with.
Lin Lin considered art to be like science. Art has its own life. It develops very logically like science, from low to high, from nothing to plenty, from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, developing very logically. Artists should treat art the way scientists treat science.
He was ready to absorb what was in front of him, bring that into what he already has, and come out with something totally new, and in that regard, make you an even better person.
I remember one teacher telling him in his earliest phase, he did this work, it was sort of like this pop Chinese paintings. These Picassoid figures would be like eating rice with chopsticks or something. The teachers hated it. And I remember one teacher telling him that his work was too Chinese.
Obviously, there is discrimination against Asian Americans. But Lin didn't consider himself an Asian American. Lin considered himself Chinese.
Lin Lin and I share a common feeling. We usually did not compare the treatment of Chinese artists with that of white artists in the United States, but rather we compared what it was like to be a Chinese artist in China with being a Chinese artist in America. Making this comparison made us complain less about the difficulties and the treatment we experienced in this country.
He liked New York because it was free. In other words, it gave him real opportunities to learn and to do his art, and because it was so endlessly stimulating. Remember, he knew China. He had a very limited movement in China. He was ready for something else.
In the second year of art school, our class took a field trip to a village in Anhui province. In the early 60s, in Anhui province during the famine, for 3 years it was very poor and many people died. A lot of families in the countryside would hold meetings to decide which son to keep, and then all the food would be given to that son to eat. So many daughters died, and many young men, like us, who survived, were bachelors, because there were very few women left. According to what the local peasants told us, many of the young people who survived ate a lot of dead people's flesh. Lin Lin was very interested in this place and painted many paintings. After that trip, Lin Lin painted a painting of a nude woman breastfeeding several children. I thought it was a very realistic painting, reflecting the reality of the local people in that area. But the professors thought the painting was out of bounds, that it reflected too much the backwardness of our socialist system. Lin Lin was very straightforward. Whatever he thought, he did. He never told lies, and this got him in trouble with a lot of the professors. Also, near the time of our graduation, because of the political movement, there was pressure to catch someone, and Lin Lin became a scapegoat.
When we were taking our graduation pictures, his case had just been dealt with, and it was just after Lin had been forced out from school. Our graduation picture had already been set up and had to be taken. While the picture being taken, we saw Lin Lin walk by with his head down. How could we smile for the picture? It was impossible.
At that time, I felt very sad. We had been studying together for 4 years. Why just 20 days before his graduation was he prevented from graduating? He was very hurt by this, and I will not forget that image of him.
At the time, Lin Lin was a typical underground artist. He painted many nudes at home. I heard that the local police interrogated him and gave him a lot of trouble. They said his paintings were pornographic.
At that time, his graduation painting and thesis were already finished. He was just waiting for the graduation ceremony. In his situation, being forced to withdraw from school before graduation and return to Shanghai was considered being a bad element, like someone who had been expelled. I heard that a lot of foreigners interested in China and Chinese art wanted to see what his paintings were like. Then, when foreigners went to his house to see his paintings, the police investigated and labeled him a bad element.
He keeps saying, like, I don't want the people look at my painting and think I was a political dissident, and then give me credit on this and think my painting's good. I just want people to know nothing of my past. Of course, it's not possible, but that's his attitude.
As an artist and a new immigrant, he had a positive attitude towards life. No matter what difficulties he encountered, he would take a positive approach and not complain. Like sometimes he would joke that one day when he had money, he would buy an Italian-made leather jacket. But in fact, until he died, he wore the same jacket he brought from China. But if you went to his studio, you would be very surprised. He had acquired many expensive art books and art supplies. He spent all his money on this thing.
The total rent for our apartment in Harlem was about $400. 6 of us Chinese students share it. Lin Lin had a very large studio and also a small bedroom. The studio was where he spent most of his time. Normally, he would spend 5 days a week in the studio and 2 days painting on the street.
After I got to America, when I first saw that place, I was a bit disappointed. Thought it was very dirty, but after a few days I got used to it. When I first arrived in America, we were very poor. Lin Lin had only about $300 left. Then we bought a refrigerator, and we hardly had anything left. A week later, I found a job in a grocery store as a cashier. The pay was very low, but at that time, as long as we had a little money and could survive, we were satisfied.
So he changed his name to Billy Harlem for the reasons that he explained about living in Harlem and loving Billie Holiday's music. And it was kind of almost a funny name in a way for him to have. It didn't make much sense for him. I mean, I'd known him as Ling Ling, and I continued to call him that. I think most people did.
And one night he invited us up and had some kind of hot pots on the table. And the wiring in the building was so bad that we kept blowing fuses.
Kept popping the fuse.
It would be pitch dark. It was an awful neighborhood, and they had to go out and try and buy fuses. And
right,
in the middle of the night, I don't know where they got them.
We got fuses, and then everyone else in the apartment had to totally turn off all of their computers, the lights, everything, while Ling entertained
And we
us.
had the dinner. It was a wonderful dinner, though.
Yeah, I felt bad, though.
I did, too. But it was such a community of people that
Pan
worked
had to,
together. You know,
Pan had to turn off his
since
computer, everything.
Pan was so cool. But that was one of the nice things that you noticed about he and his Chinese friends and associates. They always worked together in a way that was striking, that you had to notice. There was like this communal activity. Americans don't
do that.
Naturally do it so comfortably. And that was kind of interesting to observe.
When he was making his tire painting, he spent almost all his time just looking for different types of abandoned tires. We didn't have a car, and he didn't want to bother our friends too much. Then he would tell me to take a walk with him. We walked for about half an hour to the garage to find the tires. Each of us would take a tire and move it back home. We considered it a workout. Sometimes we competed to see who could move faster. It was a lot of fun. When we were free, we loved to go to the zoo to see the animals. We loved that place very much. Next to the zoo, there was a botanical garden, which was also our favorite. How can I put it? My whole life was centered around Lin Lin. Back in Shanghai, Lin Lin loved to keep crickets as pets. In America, Lin wanted to see the American crickets. I often went with him to the botanical gardens to look for crickets.
Ling Ling liked a lot were crickets. I have a painting, and I used the cricket as a symbol for Ling Ling. It's called Homage to Ling Ling.
At first he claimed that the Chinese crickets were the most beautiful crickets and the best, most aggressive crickets. And, but then he found out that the American crickets were
bigger, better,
louder, stronger, and
he
actually
loved them. He took one home to Harlem. Remember, he had
more.
He had a bunch of them up there.
And he found that he later even confessed that he found them even subtler and actually prettier than even Chinese crickets. So it was a big victory for American culture that we had great crickets.
He liked to be with me. We had to live apart twice. I was in Japan for 4 months, and he had come to America for 2 years. Once he told me that he didn't want us to be apart anymore. He could not bear the separation, not even a month.
I think my lasting impression of Ling is one of a very talented guy with a lot of guts, a lot of daring, a great deal of drive, a full amount of ego, who was not going to be deterred by anything, who was going to go ahead and fulfill his vision for himself to the best that he could, whatever it took. And it was this strength of character that I think I'm going to most remember about Lin. And I think it's the thing that we're all going to most remember, because it was his intractability in the face of tremendous odds that very few other people have ever experienced.
I don't know that much about Chinese society, but from what I've read and heard, it seems relatively safe as long as you obey the rules. And when you come here, there are no rules. And he was a victim of a ruleless, lawless, senseless crime. But he would not have stayed in China and obeyed the rules anyway, so he may have been a victim there as well.
He had the kind of artistic and intellectual energy, curiosity, that you really didn't find so much among New York artists.
To me, Lin Lin was the most lively person I had ever met. He was full of energy. I always had an impression that he would never die. It's impossible. Although 3 days before he was shot, we discussed death. When we were together, we always sang. Lin and I would sing duets. We were so happy.
His dream was to live on a small piece of land and grow his own food and have an incredibly simple lifestyle.
Our hope for life was to have a clean living environment. For example, a clean bathroom. And on top of it all, we wanted to have more time to visit the zoo together.
If he were with me now, I would like to tell him something I had never told him before. In this world, I love him dearly.